Welcome to the Partial Historians.
We explore all the details of ancient Rome.
Everything from political scandals, the love affairs, the battles waged, and when citizens turn against each other. I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. We consider Rome as the Romans saw it, by reading different authors from the ancient past and comparing their stories.
Join us as we trace the journey of Rome from the founding of the city. Hello and welcome to a special episode of The Partial Historians. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G.
Now, Dr. G, you know that I break out in a cold sweat at the thought of translating anything.
It's true. I think I do as well at this point. I feel, yeah.
So I am super excited to have an expert in translation on our show today. We are going to be chatting to Stephanie McCarter, who is currently a professor of classics at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. She published a monograph entitled Horace Between Freedom and Slavery, the first book of epistles, in 2015, and a translation of Horace's Oppose, Odes, and Carmen Seculare in 2020. However, she has recently been spending more time with a man named Ovid. Her 2022 translation of his Metamorphoses has received much acclaim, and this is what we will be focusing on today. However, before we start, we would like to warn our listeners that this episode will touch on instances of violence and sexual assault. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. This is a great treat. I'm super excited to be on this particular podcast because I spend so much time in Australia. My husband's an Aussie, so I sometimes try to. My kids are Aussies, so this is exciting.
It is very exciting for us to have you on the show and to talk about this particular translation. But before we get into the actual translating stuff, just so I can, ease myself into it, not have too many nightmares, let's start with a brief biography of Ovid. Who is this guy?
Well, he is we think of him as who he would like us to believe he is. So most of what we know from him comes from his own poetry. We know very little about him outside of that. And, part of constructing his biography means picking and choosing the bits you want to believe, right? But in terms of who he is, we know he was the last of the major Augustan poets who were living and writing during the rise and reign of Augustus, along with Virgil and then Horace. I tend to think of Virgil, Horace, and Ovid as the big three. We need to be really careful with what he tells us because most of it comes from one poem, Tristia 4:10, which he writes when he's in exile. And he's clearly trying to frame himself in a particular kind of quasi-heroic light, right? So it's hard to know what's poetic fiction and what is fact. He was born in Sulmo, Italy in 43 BCE, about a year after the assassination of Julius Caesar, almost to the day, March 20th. Caesar, of course, famously killed on the Ides of March. And so he was about 12 or so when Augustus came to power. So, he really came of age during Augustus's rise, and then he died about a year after Augustus. So his life really straddles this period of Rome's own metamorphosis, right, from a republic into an empire. And so I think that might be one reason he's interested in the idea of transformation, because one of the things he brings out in the Metamorphoses is how states transform. So I think some of this is tied into his own experience in Rome. His family was equestrian, so that he was not from a super elite family, but certainly wealthy enough to send him to be educated in Rome, along with his brother, who died when he was young. He clearly received a stellar oratorical education, which he put to great use in the poem. But he ultimately decided not to embark on a career as a politician or an orator, and he decided that poetry was where he wanted to proceed instead. We know that he married, according to what he tells us, 3 times. The last marriage lasted for many years. He had a daughter, and he was a grandpa too, which we don't really think of Ovid as, a grandpa, but he tells us that he was. And perhaps the biggest event of his life was his exile. This is the one that we are spilling a lot of ink over. He was exiled probably the same year the Metamorphoses was published, the year 8. He tells us that he was exiled because of a carmen and an error, a poem and a mistake. Most people would agree that the poem was the Ars Amatoria, because you could very easily, if you wanted to, argue that that's a manual for picking up married women, and adultery was a crime under Augustus. But he wasn't exiled until 8 years later. So the mistake is probably what really got him exiled. Nobody knows what that was. We know he saw something. I don't speculate because I think that's playing Ovid's game. He wants us to speculate, and he's never going to tell us, and he wants us to keep talking about this for 2,000 years. And he wrote many poems in exile, wanting to be recalled to Rome, wasn't, and so died still in exile in Thomas on the Black Sea. So that's a very quick overview of his life.
I would just like to highlight for our listeners that it is Augustus, yes, Augustus, who is responsible for keeping this poetic genius in exile.
I see what you're doing there.
Some people think, it has been speculated that maybe he's making the entire thing up.
Ooh, scandalo.
I'm quite drawn to, I don't think that's necessarily true, but I like the idea that maybe he's just, this is a persona. We don't really think he was a pickup artist, do we? Even though he purports to be in the Amores and Ars Amatoria. So it's a kind of funny thought that maybe we've been speculating about something that he just made
so
up.
Wrong.
It would be the biggest prank, yeah. Although I do enjoy visioning him as like a creepy grandpa type of guy. The one that tells all the inappropriate jokes and is like hugely embarrassing.
Absolutely, that would be Ovid for sure.
Don't invite him to your family lunch, just in case. So the Metamorphoses is a hugely influential text through time, and partly because it's so mythologically based. Tales of the gods, tales of mortals. These are the stories that really draw people into the ancient world in many cases for the first time. But it's more than that. And I'm interested in your view about what is the Metamorphoses about. And you kind of touched on that idea of the transformation of Rome itself. And I'm wondering if there's other ways into the text that are like that or build from there as well.
This is such a difficult question to even start to ponder, because I begin to think, what is it not about? Right? It is about everything from the creation of the universe to Ovid's own day. This is what he tells us. The various transformations that have happened throughout all time, right? And so transformation brings us, that is its simple, it's sort of most straightforward theme. He tells us in the opening line, he's going to talk about shapes changed, right? Mutatas formos, that's metamorphoses. But it's about so much more, like what changes forms, right? That's the big question. It's time, so it's about time and its movement. Power changes forms frequently in this poem. And also so much of it just focused around the body, right? Probably the most important word in the opening poem is corpora, which is bodies. It's shapes transformed into new bodies. And so you think that's weird because it should be bodies changed into new shapes. And so, he invites you to ponder, what is a body? What does that mean? So this is why you can kind of think of the universe as a body, the state as a body. And then, of course, we as humans having bodies that are really subject to change and transformation. So it's about, what does it mean to have a human body? What does it mean to exist in a world that it changes along with the body? And then it also invites us to think about identity. So it's about that. What is the relationship between a body and the identity that inhabits it, right? When the shape is changed into a new body, what happens to the being that inhabited the body to begin with? Is it lost? And so, yeah, it's about so many different things. It's about gender, right? And the way that that might relate to a body. You have so many characters in this epic who transform in terms of gender. And you have a big focus on female characters as well. And so how does an epic itself transform when you shift the focus onto women, right? This is, I think, something that Ovid is really interested in. So many of the epics that we think of, the Aeneid, the Iliad, the Odyssey. I mean, the Odyssey opens with the word man, right? It is a male-focused genre for sure. And so just by changing that focus, he transforms the genre in so many interesting ways. So I could go on forever about what the Metamorphoses is about, but I think maybe what it's fundamentally about is how the force of change and transformation connects us in so many ways, right? How all these things are connected. And you can't stop change. And that's actually a pretty good thing.
It does mean that there's a sense that the text resonates continuously through time, because change is the one thing that we always are feeling and understanding. And even though we might resist change, there's a real compulsion to try and understand it better. And I think Ovid has done something supremely clever by tapping into this as a thematic focus.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it means he can be changed too, right? His text can be changed and transformed through translation, through art, through adaptation in ways that will make him stay relevant always.
It is kind of ironic, isn't it, that change is a constant in all of our lives.
That is true.
How important would you say this text was in his own time and then in subsequent centuries?
Oh, goodness. I mean, from the very beginning, it was important. I mean, you can't have any of the epics that follow in the wake of it without this text. One of my favorite epics is Statius's Thebaid. I absolutely love it, but it wouldn't exist without Ovid and Virgil. And so he's sort of folding both of those epics into the Thebaid. You see its influence in art pretty immediately because of, the frescoes you see in Pompeii that are clearly based on Ovid's Metamorphoses. And not just in Pompeii, you see this across the ancient world. And then, of course, in our own time, we in the English-speaking world, he has resonated across the centuries. You have Shakespeare's most famous play, arguably, is Romeo and Juliet. You wouldn't have that without Ovid's Pyramus and Thisbe. You wouldn't have huge chunks of Midsummer Night's Dream without Pyramus and Thisbe as well. I'm thinking of in terms of art. Famously, Ovid has inspired more art than any text apart from the Bible, and continues to. One of my favorite painters working right now is a woman named Elizabeth Columba, who very often works with Ovidian material. She has a fabulous painting of Daphne that's responding powerfully to Bernini's Daphne in Apollo sculpture. So, in some ways, because Ovid is so malleable, we can use him as something of a mirror in which we can see our own literary and artistic taste change and react to what went before. So we've been using him for so long. I'm thinking also of, his influence on, opera, his influence on the stage in general, his influence on so many rewritings of myth that are coming out right now. You wouldn't have Madeline Miller's Circe without Ovid's Circe, for example. Mary Zimmerman's play, The Metamorphoses. I'm reading right now another new play, Polaroid Stories by Naomi Izuka. I'm sure I may not be pronouncing her name correctly, but there's so many wonderful theatrical productions of Ovid. So yeah, he's everywhere. He's absolutely everywhere.
Well, it sounds good that we're talking about it then, if it's such a crucial text from the ancient world.
And I think this is the sort of thing as well. Well, this is like a small anecdote, but I was out yesterday with some friends from a broader circle of people, and they were kind of like, well, what are you doing tomorrow? And I was like, oh, I'm going to interview this wonderful academic about Ovid's Metamorphoses. And they're like, what's that? And I was like, you will be surprised about how much you have already engaged with his text through one of the variations and adaptations that have happened over time. And I was like, I went straight to Shakespeare and I was like, look, and then we move out from there. And I want to, first of all, just stand in awe of you for a moment, because translation is a gargantuan task. And I think the further we go through time, the more history we have of translation and engagement with ancient texts as well. So every scholar of each new generation who engages in translation kind of has this whole history of what has come before in order to encounter all of that before they get to their own translation and how they're going to position things. And not even all academics get the chance to really engage in in-depth translation work. So I'm wondering if you can walk us a little bit through your process as a translator.
Oh, goodness. It's a little tricky to explain. I love minutia. I love working in minutia. I've always liked that. And I always was drawn to poetry. And so even from the time I was in high school, I loved poetry. I was a sort of secret poetry nerd. And I had to leave a lot of the English poetry I really liked behind when I chose classics over English literature. And so I guess about in the summer of 2016, I just sat down and started translating, but I had no process. I had no idea what I was doing. Really, what it took for me was to figure out that I wanted to write formal poetry in translation, and that became a real guide and friend to me, because like a lot of classicists, I was not terribly good at literary translation. We tend to be trained to do a hyperliteral kind of translation that doesn't sound so great to somebody who's reading the text for its literary quality. So it took me for a long time to work out any kind of process at all. With this particular translation, I translated it in iambic pentameter. I made it my full-time job. I actually lived in Australia for most of the time I was translating the initial draft of this. We were in Brisbane for the year. And, woke up every day, 9 to 5, translating into iambic pentameter so much that I started thinking in iambic pentameter. And then it took me several years to get the draft complete. A lot of that was due to COVID and having 2 small kids. And then one thing I always do once I have a translation is I always teach it, because I want to see how it goes with my students and how they react to it, where things are not working for them. And so I taught it in a class I was teaching on women's adaptation of Ovid. And they gave me great feedback. And then I spent months revising and revising and revising and revising. But yeah, it's it's a meticulous process. So I'm sitting down I don't feel like translation for me is like a process of being inspired or anything like that. Like I'm using commentaries. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about how I love concordances. I don't know if you know what concordances are, but they're the most boring possible books.
But so good.
They just It's wonderful. Like, it's like every time, an ancient author, so I was talking about my Horace concordance and how much I loved it. But, you can look up every time he uses the word good.
Yeah.
It'll tell you everywhere. So, I mean, it's really old fashioned kind of tools like commentaries, dictionaries, concordances, spreading them all around and turning yourself into a bit of a, maniac for like books.
Yeah, I kind of love this. There's like the word nerd comes out. And you're like, yes. You're like, look at this. And then it appeared here. And then it didn't appear for another 50 years. Like, what's going on? It must be special.
Well, that's true. And so then how do you translate that word that is a weird word that Ovid only uses once, right? Then you have to reach for a weird word in English that works there. So, just getting yourself into that space where you're kind of inhabiting lots of different roles at once, strangely. So you're a scholar, right? You're using really scholarly tools where you're using your tools for literary criticism. So you're having to interpret the poem always. And then you're also having to be an artist where you are trying to transform that into workable English literature. So it's a strange thing to try to do, but it's a pleasurable thing So I won't stop translating anytime soon.
I kind of love this as well, the idea of translation as another metamorphosis as well.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put that out there. So are there particular translations that resonated for you when you were approaching your own translation?
Well, I think that I knew several of the translations pretty well. I mean, I've taught Ovid so many times over the years. And yeah, so I wouldn't say that I was committed to any translation. I knew them, and because I had taught out of them so much, I knew where the limitations of each one was. And in the classes that I was teaching him in, it was mainly, I teach a course on women and gender in the ancient world, and then I teach another course on sexuality in the ancient world. So two separate courses. And then I also teach Ovid in like a Latin seminar where we are dissecting the Latin together very slowly. And so in the women and gender and sexuality courses, I wasn't able to find translations that dealt with the aspects of sexual violence and what was going on in terms of gender and the body. I needed translations that brought those issues to the fore, and I just wasn't finding them. And then on the other hand, in my Latin seminars, I just wasn't finding translations that did poetically what I needed them to do in order to teach these students who were dissecting the Latin and finding ways for them to see that reflected in the translations we were also looking at. So that meant that my goals became twofold. I really wanted to produce a poetic translation. So this is, formal poetry. It's iambic pentameter. I wanted it to be really accessible rather. I tend to like poetry that is really accessible. And so my favorite poet is Philip Larkin, and he's so straight. I mean, he's so accessible, and so much of the power of his poetry comes from its seeming simplicity of language. But then when you dig in and you see how he's handling meter and alliteration and all of these wonderful things, you can see its artistry. And so I think it works because it is so seemingly simple, but really artistically refined. And so I wanted to try to make something highly readable, but when you dug in, you could actually see the cool poetic stuff that Ovid is also doing. So, it's not hard to read, I don't think, my translation. I wanted to make something that you could read rather quickly, but then you can go in and you can say, okay, there's all this alliteration. Here's this enjambment. She's working with caesuras in the line, kind of like Ovid is doing. Here's a reversal of this metrical foot that mimics what Ovid is doing. So that was one goal. So it's poetic, readable. On the other hand, I wanted to be really straightforward with the sexual violence and leave nothing ambiguous, because it's not ambiguous in the Latin. And so I think a lot of that was me being motivated through the feminist lens through which I had taught Ovid for so long, and I don't think that a lot of the previous translators were actively wanting to euphemize it. They just didn't have that goal, right? It wasn't a goal that they had set out for themselves. And so they ended up euphemizing it for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
This is probably a great opportunity for us to delve in a little deeper and allow you to give us an example or two of how your new translation does allow for a more nuanced understanding of the meaning suggested by the Latin. So can you tell us a little bit about like one or two instances where you were, meeting those goals about dealing with the sexual violence, in a way that was probably needed in this sort of day and age, I suppose?
Sure. I mean, there are various ways in which this comes out, I think, in the translation. And first of all, I should say that it's an important thing Ovid wants us to wrestle with, right? I mean, he's really interested in the way power exerts itself on the body and causes it to transform. And I think he recognizes that for a lot of people, rape is a transformative force that exerts itself on the body. And so it's part of the theme. And so you can't hide it. You shouldn't hide it. You shouldn't euphemize it. A lot of this is just in the language he uses for rape. So the basic word that Ovid uses to indicate rape is the Latin word for force, which is vis, V-I-S. And this was a legal charge you could bring against somebody. And he uses two formulations of this. One is to experience force, that is, we would say, to be raped. The other word he uses is to inflict force, so vim inferi. And that would be to rape. So there's no word in Latin that we can translate literally as to rape. I mean, that means only that in the way that the English word does. But his words are very clear. He uses clear Latin legal terms that would map onto our word for to rape and to be raped. So here's an example of that. This comes in book 3. This is the mother of Narcissus. Her name is Liriope. She's a nymph. And Ovid, he uses this formulation. The river god Cephisus inflicts force on her. So this is what we're talking about. He raped her. I wanted to keep language of force in there because for me, it's really important to connect these scenes with other moments when Ovid discusses vis or force, because it's not just rape. It's throughout the epic, and it's just rape is one type of force that Ovid designates with this term. They're all transformative, right? So my translation says, Cephisus once had trapped her, Liriope, in his curved stream and raped her forcibly, his currents snaring her. So I tried to use language. So he raped her forcibly. That's how I translated, like he inflicted force, but also words that would suggest that this wasn't an embrace, right? He ensnared her. He trapped her. The word, one word that Ovid uses in the Latin there is where is it here? Implicuit, which means like he entangled her, right? And then we have, vim tulit. So it is a very clear indication that he raped her. Some translations do this fine. David Rayburn, for example, he writes that the Cephisus, the river god, caught her in the folds of his sinuous stream and then proceeded to rape. So it's clear, right? Then you get other translators who are less clear. So, for example, we have Mandelbaum, who says that within his waves, he snared the azure nymph and had his way. Had his way, you're getting into very euphemistic territory with that particular phrase. Yeah. But then you get the one that is the most common way to translate Ovidian rape. And Humphreys demonstrates this. This is Rolf Humphreys, his 1955 translation. We're told, the naiad of the river, Liriope, whom the river god Cephisus embraced and ravished, right? In his watery dwelling. And you just get so many translations like that. So it's not about trapping, it's about embracing. And then ravishing no longer means to rape, right? I mean, you can look at the covers of a million romance books, and they're going to have the word ravish in them. There's one I always show my students. It's called Ravish Me Completely or something like that. And so we just don't use it in that way anymore. So to me, it becomes a comfortable way that translators can translate the language of rape without actually having to say rape.
It's funny you say that because as soon as you said ravish, immediately my mind went to a romance novel cover.
Absolutely. One thing I do all the time when I'm translating, all the time, several times a day, is when I want to figure out what the nuances are of the words that I'm choosing, I'll go to Google Images and I'll type them in just to see what pops up. So if I want to avoid like language that's too feminizing or something for a character who's not, and it's not in the Latin feminizing language, I'll go type it in just to make sure. And so that brings me to a second way that I have tried to do things differently in my translation. And that is to avoid like gendering language when it's not present in the Latin. So let me see if I can find an example of this. There's a couple of ways this happens. One is in the figure of Callisto, who you may know is a virginal huntress who models herself on Diana. And Diana is famously gender nonconforming, right? And so Callisto also is gender nonconforming in so many different ways. Not only is she taking part in masculine pursuits like hunting, she's also refusing to get married and have children. She wants to stay a virgin forever. So Ovid describes her as having messy hair. The Latin words are neglectos copulos. So her neglected hair is really what this means. And the word copulos, with the word capillary from this, it has no gender connotation. She's just got neglected hair. So I translated this as messy hair. And I did a Google image search and I got lots of masculine presenting people and feminine presenting people. And I was like, okay, that works. But when you look at other translators, we have things like, here's David Rayburn, that she has loose flowing tresses, right?
Ooh,
and if yes,
men never have tresses, do they?
No, they never do. So if you go into Google Images and you type in loose flowing tresses, you're going to get so many super feminine presenting hairstyles, right? So it was just being very careful with things like that. The way you translate the body. What is this character wearing? If it's a female character, is her clothing gender specific? Usually it's not. So trying to avoid that. It's very important for a character like Callisto, right? Who doesn't embrace her femininity at all. She has no femininity to embrace. The other thing is little additions sometimes that translators will make. And this is one I've talked about quite a lot. So Daphne is very similar to Callisto. She's a virginal huntress. She wants to spend her time in the woods, and she actively rejects things that are associated with femininity. And Apollo attempts to rape her. Prior to this, he's looking at her body. And when he's looking at her, Ovid doesn't give her body any adjectives that would be feminizing at all. He's just looking at her eyes. Ovid tells us that they're kind of bright like stars. He mentions her lips, fingers, hands, arms, shoulders. So I didn't give those any adjectives. So I translated that as he sees her eyes gleaming like stars, her lips, but those it's not enough to see. He marvels at her fingers, her hands, her arms, her shoulders, nearly bare. The parts he cannot see, he thinks are better. Other translators will add little things to feminize her. So, for example, Alan Mandelbaum says that she has fingers, hands, and wrists that are unsurpassed. So he throws in an extra body part and gives it an adjective. David Rayburn says that she has teasingly tempting lips, delicate fingers, shapely arms. And so it's just little things like that that really they do make a huge difference. So it was not just the scenes involving the language of sexual violence, but also the way bodies are described and the way that gender and sexuality are presented.
I'm just in awe of the amount of effort that you put into this translation. Sorry, I'm just like gobsmacked. I always suspected that this is what it was like. Yeah. But actually hearing you talk about it.
I won't even tell you how many times translators mention breasts that are not there.
I mean, I guess the temptation is real for some, but so I think this is all really, really interesting because it's allowing a way into the Latin through translation that maybe has not been available up until now. And part of this way of thinking about gender, I think, is also like what sort of consciousness and experiences and ideas are translators bringing to the work that they do. And to segue slightly, you're the first woman to translate Ovid's Metamorphoses into English verse in many, many years. There was Mary Inn's translation, which goes back to 1955. And more broadly speaking, how do you think your own perception and that you bring as a human being to translation, how do you think that has factored into the way you've approached this?
I think so much of this is to do with the fact that I teach young people who won't let me get away with anything else. I mean, I really think that is what so much of it has boiled down to. There are women who translate ancient texts all the time and replicate exactly some of these same things. So I don't, and this is something Emily Wilson has talked about as well. I think that one of the interviews she gave, I was just reading, where she talks about, she didn't arrive at her interpretations of these texts via the superpower of being a girl, right?
What? No.
women can replicate these things as well. However, I think that for me, my own experiences inhabiting my body and my identity as a woman, I think they have played into my experience of the world that has led me to try to read and translate Ovid with a particular set of goals, right? And so I just laid out clearly from the very beginning what my goals were. But so much of these goals have been formed by teaching young women, and I see what they go through in this world. And so there has been a real feeling of responsibility toward them. And so not just toward myself, but toward the young women who have had to live in a world that sees their bodies in certain ways, that insists on seeing their bodies in certain ways, that frames their experiences of coercion in certain ways. And, I've been teaching young women and men for, at Sewanee for almost 16 years now, before that for a long time. And my motivations were pretty much for my students and wanting to give them a text, no matter their gender, that would help them think more clearly about, what is the relationship between their identities and their bodies? Like, how can they see reflections in this text of what they're going through in this world? And I just felt they needed the tools to do that, and a really good, accurate translation that tried to capture those nuances was something I felt I could give to the young people who are going to be reading this epic, I hope, for a long time to come.
I think that's a really interesting thing. I think one of the things I like so much about your translation and reading about your translation is that you're not trying to hide your goals, as you say. They're very much at the forefront. And personally, I believe that it's really hard for historians, classicists, translators to be completely objective when they're doing anything. And so I think being transparent about what it is you're trying to do with your work is important, because if you're not, it might lead people to maybe think that, that you're maybe straying into the territory of, say, inaccuracy or something like that. But when you're clear about, look, this is what I'm trying to do, you've given some really great examples of where people you feel are being inaccurate to the Latin. But if you think about their context, it's probably their context that is leading them to make those choices, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is why I have felt fairly confident in calling it a feminist translation, because I think that feminism has actually given me a modes and strategies through which to produce a more accurate translation. And I think that inverts people's expectations in some way. We tend to think that a feminist translator is going to alter the text. But I think, and again, this is something that Emily Wilson has also talked about, that a translator who is more kind of ideologically motivated might be better empowered to scrutinize their own biases in a way that a translator who automatically assumes that they have no biases won't, right? And I think to think of translation as ever being something we can do completely objectively is a kind of dangerous thing to do, right? We always need to recognize that any kind of interpretive framework is going to be shaped by culture. We're never going to be able to exist outside of our culture and what we've learned. I think that what we should do is become not only good critics of ancient literary texts, but also good critics of our own culture, so that we can be aware of how we're being shaped by it.
Oh, and you're juggling so many things when you're doing a translation that you're not necessarily doing when you're, say, writing a history, which is not only being conscious of your own potential biases, but also the fact that you're juggling, as you said earlier, that artistic angle as well, trying to translate that into a totally different language. It's just so many things you have to keep in mind, so many balls in the air.
That's where the pleasure comes from for me. It is the artistic process of translation. So much of my motive for doing this is, to think about the themes of gender and sexual violence and all of this. But on a day-to-day basis, I was wrestling with iambic pentameter
We're like, how am I going to make this line work?
Exactly. Why does Ovid have to use this strange parenthesis here that breaks the sentence apart?
It's like, you're ruining it for me, Ovid. Stop that. And I think they're the sort of like the technical elements of like playing with language, because obviously the way that Latin flows in its cadence is completely different from the way English operates. So the task is mammoth to sort of go from the epic meter that Ovid is using in one language to the kind of meter that works in English that is well established, that people think of as naturally poetic and also mimicking naturalized speech to a certain extent. Thinking about the modern reader of Ovid, because I remember approaching Ovid for the first time in translation and not being particularly enamored of the text. And I think, so translation has a huge influential role in the way that people get into texts like this. And for me personally, the little historian inside me, I love the Fasti because it's packed with so much detail for the sorts of things I'm interested in, which means I haven't spent as much time with the Metamorphoses. So what can modern readers gain from engaging with Ovid's Metamorphoses?
Well, I think for any of his texts, but especially the Metamorphoses, I mean, the primary thing is going to be pleasure, right? He's a masterful storyteller. And probably, to my mind, some of his stories are the most delightful stories from the Roman world and the Greek world that you will read. And he's clever, right? His wordplay is something that drove me completely bonkers trying to to reproduce. That's, again, part of the pleasure. So much of it is just going to be the sheer pleasure. We love stories. We love old stories. We love seeing the playfulness with which Ovid tells them and the strange, inventive ways with which he connects them. So just the sheer joy of reading that. But I think probably more than in any other ancient work, we can think with Ovid. I think he also challenges us continually across the ages. He's always going to appeal, no matter what the age is that's reading them, to the sensibilities of that age, because he is so malleable. And so I think for some of my students, it's so shocking that they will read this ancient text and he has transgender characters, right? He has characters who are non-binary. I mean, so explicitly so. And it's not, and so they can see that we haven't just invented certain concerns, right? That these have been here. We've been thinking about these things for so long. And so I think for a reader coming to this text, you'll be blown away by the fact that we are still in our most current discourse, part of a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. And I think you can really see that with Ovid pretty much more than with anybody, because, I mean, in some ways, Ovid is so interested in exploring the experiences of characters who aren't going to be the center, right, in other stories. So the other epics that we have in the ancient world, as I was saying, they have, a male protagonist at the very center. They have a clear goal. Ovid isn't interested in any of that. There's no protagonist in this story. There's no clear goal. And the most interesting characters are women. And so he's going to constantly be saying, well, what if we don't turn the lens on Aeneas, but we turn the lens on the people, the women around him, right? And we see the story through their eyes. So we see this in the Heroides, right? Which is a series of letters that are written by mythological women who are often very victimized by these male heroes. And so from the very beginning of his poetic output, he's interested in thinking, well, what if we told this story through this side character's point of view? And so I think he's very good as a storyteller of reminding us that there are more than one ways to tell every story. There's so many ways you can tell the same story. And every single character involved in any event is going to have their own version. So he helps us to resist the idea of this singular authoritative tell. And so that's so fun to think with. He leaves open so many alternatives. And so I think this is one great reason we return to him again and again, because we are doing the very sorts of rethinking, reframing that he himself has modeled for us. So one reason I love Elizabeth Colombo's work so much, she's the painter that I mentioned before, is that she is taking Ovid's stories and completely reframing them, I think, in a way that he would love, right? So he gives us a he gives us a Daphne who's been shot by Cupid's arrow. Well, Elizabeth Columba has her standing there with Cupid's arrow. And so, I mean, anybody who's listening to this, just go do a Google image search for Elizabeth Columba's Daphne. And so I mean, I think that he models how to be playful with stories and how to, to see ourselves as part of an ongoing dialogue in ways that no other ancient author, to my mind, quite does.
You've definitely inspired me to spend the rest of the day perusing his work.
Oh, good.
So I have to finish off with another little peek behind the curtain in terms of this new translation, because one of the things that struck me straight away when I first saw it was the cover art and the way that the text was formatted and that sort of thing. It just made me curious about how much input you actually had as the translator into the publication and the formatting that went into this work, and how you think the layout might affect the way that people engage with it.
Sure. Can I talk about the cover for a moment? Because I love
Absolutely.
I love the cover so much.
It is so great.
I wish I were the brilliant person who would come up with the cover, but I am not. However, when I saw it, I was gleeful. What I told them was I didn't want an image of a woman being victimized on the cover. That was really important to me. Because again, it's how do we frame these stories becomes so important. And so I wanted a way to frame it around women's agency rather than women's victimization. So the one directive I gave to the art team at Penguin was, I'm more interested in Philomela's tapestry than her rape. And then they came back with this wonderful cover by, it features a tapestry by a Japanese artist. Her name is Aiko Tezuka. And she uses tapestry as a way to explore metamorphosis. So she'll often take old tapestries, unweave them, and reweave them, which is just wonderful for Ovid.
It's perfect.
It's perfect. And he uses tapestry so much as a metaphor. So even from the very first lines of the epic, he asks the gods to spin out a song for him. And so it's a process of spinning, and then he's going to weave it together. And then you have so many wonderful female artists in the epic. You have Philomela, who uses tapestry as a way to narrate her rape when she's lost her tongue because her rapist cuts it out. You have Arachne, who weaves a tapestry in competition with Minerva. You have the Minyades, who are these wonderful set of sisters who tell stories while they're weaving. So it really, I think it puts women's art in particular front and center, and it's such an important theme. The colors are red and white. Those are the dominant colors on the cover, and those colors are so important throughout the Metamorphoses. Philomela's tapestry is red markings on a white background, and so that color combination was important to me as well. It doesn't feature a central myth, just as Ovid's doesn't. In fact, the middle is kind of wiped out by the unweaving of the tapestry that's happening. So it kind of shows you there is no central myth here that we're going to be dealing with. And also it features some wonderful modern images. There's like a DNA double helix. There's also a uterus. I don't know if you noticed that there's a uterus.
I did not see that.
So I like this idea of the undoing of the body that the cover kind of evokes. So I love the cover so much. I can't even tell you how much. I'm so happy.
It is gorgeous. It is gorgeous. Yeah.
The formatting inside is probably a bit different from most other translators of the Metamorphoses because it kind of sets each tale apart, like it separates them and gives each like its own big title. Those big titles are invented by me. Those are not in the Latin text. And that's a little bit different. And on the one hand, it kind of breaks up the narrative in a way that maybe other translations don't. And I can see how some people might be frustrated with that. I had no input into that. On the other hand, there's something really good about it in that I think it highlights stories that could easily get lost. I was talking with somebody, I can't remember who mentioned to me that they had never noticed that after Niobe's children are all killed, we are told that Pelops mourns for her. And Pelops is famously the victim of the gods as well. Of his own father. He was cut up by his own father, and he has the ivory shoulder, and he was fed to the gods. And when the gods figured out what his father was up to, they put him back together. And so I don't know, it's an interesting moment where this character can find sympathy for Niobe. He's the son of an impious father, and her impiety led to her own kids getting destroyed, but he can find space in himself to sympathize with her. And in my version, that's set apart, like it gets its own title, like Pelops mourns for Niobe. And this person mentioned to me they'd never even noticed it before until they read my translation. So maybe it does, that formatting can highlight stories that could easily be lost otherwise.
Well, in terms of what you said about your goal being accessibility, readability, and also thinking about the fact that, as you say, you use this text as a teacher, and therefore you kind of approach it, I think, through a teacher's lens. I think it does assist people who are using it in an educational sense and might be wanting to dip in and out of it. So, yeah. I must admit, I personally like that aspect. But yeah.
I'm good. And some of my titles that I give the different episodes are very different from the way other people have entitled those episodes. So, I mean, I think that the episode with Callisto, I just simply call that story Jove Rapes Callisto. And I know at least one other translator calls it like Jove in Arcadia. So it doesn't quite
mention the war. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was very influenced by feminist criticism of newspaper headlines that want people to say up front exactly what has happened. And I have gotten a little bit of pushback by people saying, well, when you say rape, it implies that Ovid is making a judgment. And I'm thinking to myself, well, he is clearly telling a story about rapes. If they were stories about murders, could I not use the word murder because that would imply a judgment?
Yeah, so, definitely. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I think I found the section breaks really useful, actually, because it does allow a bracketing off, and it can also, I think, be an overwhelming kind of text to approach. This is true for any epic, but when you see the translation laid out on the page, and it's like, I think to myself, what's my commitment to getting through the text? You know, like how long before I get a real break? And sometimes when you're thinking about something like the Aeneid, or we're thinking about the Odyssey, you're like, I got a whole book of poetry to get through before I get a real
exactly.
break. And it's like, if I don't sit down and make a commitment, we are in trouble. Whereas this allows for a more sort of a dipping in moment, a dipping out moment. And so yesterday I was sitting down and I was like, you know what? I'm interested in how Medea's story is being told here. And so I could go to that section and go through that part in specifics. And that would be obviously good for me to contextualize later by going out and looking at the whole book and doing that zooming out approach. But I didn't have to read the whole book in order to get there, which I think was really handy.
Oh, that's good to know. I mean, sometimes you need to catch your breath too. I mean, it gives you a moment. Horrific things happen here, right? It gives you a moment to
definitely.
And let's face it, researchers and historians, they don't always have the time to read an entire text just for the one reference that they really need.
Absolutely.
And so,
what are you talking about?
Like, I know. I'm really pulling back the veil here on what we do. But yeah, I mean, if you're given a deadline for an article or a book or something like that, you know, you only have so much time. And when you're looking at an epic text, you're like, oh my God, I just want this one reference. I can't read this whole thing.
You know, having taught Ovid many times, I can say I had never read the entire epic through before. Of course I hadn't. I mean, who sits down as a scholar of Latin poetry? So this is another reason to become a translator. It's going to compel you to read carefully all the things. I'm translating Catullus right now, and I realize as I'm going through, like, there are poems I know so well, I basically have them memorized. And there are some poems I didn't even know existed. So it's nice to be compelled to read them all.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we all do. Let's be real.
So heading towards the wrapping up phase of this interview, I'm interested in rewarding or interesting reactions to your translation that have touched you.
I think the most touching one was the book was reviewed in the New Yorker by Daniel Mendelsohn, which was wonderful, shocking. I'm still in disbelief that it was reviewed there. This was a letter that came into the New Yorker after Daniel Mendelsohn reviewed it, and this anonymous letter writer writes, I appreciated Daniel Mendelssohn's consideration of Stephanie McCarter's new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which presents the sexual violence that appears in the poem clearly. I reread the Metamorphoses earlier this year, 19 years after I was raped during the summer of my high school graduation. After a decade of therapy, I was struck by Ovid's sensitivity to the complex social and familial dynamics that follow in the wake of sexual violence. In his poetry, victims aren't simply transformed into other bodies, they are abandoned, exiled, and sometimes punished. She goes on to talk about Medusa. Medusa's story is especially illustrative. After Neptune rapes her in Minerva's temple, the goddess turns her hair into snakes and banishes her to the farthest corner of the world to live with the monstrous Gorgon sisters. All who look upon her, who witness her in shame, turn to stone. I know this phenomenon well. I have felt isolated in my biological and chosen families and have lost friends and romantic relationships because I stopped pretending, even briefly, that nothing had happened to me. People often turn away from what they prefer not to see. McCarter's translation, with its attentiveness to these elements of Ovid's poem, is a gift to those who are ready to reflect on their experiences as victims of and bystanders to rape. I hope that it helps people learn to talk about this trauma and softens hard hearts. So that, having that letter published by the New Yorker and being able to read that was something. I mean, I wept afterwards.
I was going to say, I'm tearing up just hearing that letter. That is
that is incredibly powerful. Yeah, absolutely.
So that was, for me, the most. Still, the I can read that and know that all the effort I put in was, without a doubt, worth every bit of it.
Well, I think it just goes to show that you have certainly reached those goals that you set for yourself at the beginning of the translation. And it's so touching for all of us who are involved in studying the ancient world to think about the power that an ancient text can still have in somebody's life these days.
Absolutely. And I think a good translation does show you that, Ovid he's not reveling in these characters' victimhood, right? And he's very interested in analyzing what they've gone through and their trauma, and to see that happen across millennia is, I think, quite powerful. And it's been very powerful for my students, and it's been very powerful for me personally as well, to know that there is this connection there across time.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've had a growing appreciation, I think, for translation, and I hope that this particular episode really highlights for our listeners, in an age of increasing discussion of AI and Google Translate and those sorts of features, I think it just goes to show that these sorts of things really can't replicate what you do. What a translator of any text, but I think particularly these sorts of ancient texts, you have to become, as you say, so familiar with the meter, the person. You have to think about their context, your context. You have to think about how the audience is going to respond. There's just so much and so much careful choice that goes into a translation. I mean, as I say, I'm always in awe of translators because language never came easily to me. And once I started looking into it, the more I learned about it, the more I was just utterly gobsmacked. I think it's something that we sometimes take for granted, that we can just have translations of things into the language that we want. But it's really not an easy task by any means.
Absolutely, which is why it's been so great for me to see more classical translators getting some recognition and attention. So I'm with you. For many years, I didn't think about them. I took them for granted until I became one. And now I really hope that the field will start to recognize translation a lot more. I'm hoping that we're really embracing it, and not just popularly, but also, through things like tenure and promotion, which translation has not always counted towards.
And I think this is incredible that this field that sits right at the heart of a lot of the ideas of the university as well in its sort of historical formation, that translation still in this modern era is not necessarily considered the kind of work output that is relevant for the discipline. And it's so essential. So absolutely essential.
Absolutely. I think for so long, a lot of that is because we embrace the languages so much that if, to be a real classicist, you had to study Greek and Latin, right? And rather than there being a group of classicists who could produce translations so that these could be broadly accessible, right? Classics has not always been a field that embraced accessibility. It embraced exclusivity. And I think that's played so much into the way that we have thought historically about translation. And it's not unique to classics, but I think it's been especially prominent in the field of classics.
Oh, look, yes, we were preaching to the converted, but the more I learned about translation, the more I was like, why would one person ever take this on? It's like, it's massive. You clearly need more than one brain working on this, or you need huge amounts of funding, because the time and effort that goes into it is insane. I mean, this is the thing. When Dr. G and I are working on things, sure, like if we sit down and really put our minds to it, we can do a translation, but is it going to be any good? Is it going to really capture what that person is doing?
We'll release one episode every 6 months, maybe.
Yeah, it's just like, oh my God, like, why would we even bother if we don't have the expertise? Like, we rely on people out there to produce really great translations, who have given their heart and soul to it, as you have, and who love delving into the minutiae, because otherwise, as you say, it's just a literal translation of the Latin. And so, yeah, I've often thought this is clearly something that calls for a group effort rather than one person slaving away, translating the text every 20 years when something's changed in the context and we need a new translation.
Right. And there's so many texts that have no good translations, at all. And I was told when I embarked on translation for the first time by a colleague, not in classics, but in a different field, but in an R1, what we in the US would call an R1 institution. So it's primarily research based university. So we would give you gratitude, but not tenure for, and I'll never forget those words.
So telling.
So telling. Yes, absolutely. But I am lucky that I'm at I don't think that this phenomenon exists so much in Australia, but at a liberal arts college. And so we are dedicated to teaching undergraduate students and have a very broad view of what contribution to the field looks like. And the stars on campus are the creative writers. So we have a great creative writing program. We have the Swanee Review, which is the oldest continuously published literary quarterly in the United States. The Swanee Writers Conference, which is a few weeks every summer where I sort of hide in my office because all of these wonderful writers I'm intimidated by come to town.
Oh no, you'll have to be in there next time. Come on.
Absolutely.
No. This is when I realized that novelists weren't actually gods, that they were real people. Because I would just be walking around and I would see some amazing novelists. So we have, I have benefited enormously from the context of my institution. They've been very supportive.
That is good to hear. And look, we'd love to wrap up with a final question. Are you working on something new at the moment, or are you taking a well-deserved break by the sounds of it?
There is no well-deserved break. So I have a few things. So I have a book that's coming out in September called Women in Power. It's also published by Penguin, and it is it's kind of an anthology, not a source book, but an anthology about ancient women, both mythological and real. And so we have a variety of existing translations and then some new translations. But the women that you can expect to read about are people like Dido and Hypsipyle and Omphale and Semiramis, so legendary women. I translated Aristophanes' Assemblywomen in full for that, which is a lot of fun. Then we have historical women, so we have Boudica, we have Alexandra Salome, we have Amanirenas from Queen of Kush. So we have a wide array of real women and historical and literary women. And then, so that's coming out in September. I'm also translating Catullus, so that will be out at some stage.
Oh, that will be interesting because his language is certainly a feature.
It's going to be fun. And then I just signed a contract to translate the Ars Amatoria. So
this is going to be very exciting.
I'm going to be returning both to Ovid and to Australia because I will be coming to spend another year there in 2025 to 2026 to translate the Ars Amatoria Amatoria.
I feel like we're going to have to take a flight to Brisbane.
I was going to say, I think if you're up for it, we'll have to do an in-person episode on your latest work if you're up for it.
That sounds wonderful. You could always twist my arm and get me to come down to Sydney. You're in Sydney?
This is also true. This is also true. It's a bit cooler down here, bit cooler.
Yes.
Not today, but in general.
Yeah, not right now. This summer has been just moist and awful.
Yeah. Throughout the entire interview, I've been like dabbing my forehead and my upper lip going, oh my God. Oh, well, Professor Stephanie McCarter, thank you so much for your amazing translation and for speaking to us about it today. Listeners, I'm sure you're all dying to run out and pick up a copy of the gorgeously decorated Ovid's Metamorphoses for yourself. Thank you for listening to this special episode of The Partial Historians. You can find our sources, sound credits, and an automated transcript in our show notes at www.partialhistorians.com. Our music is by Bettina Joy de Guzman. You too can support our show and help us to produce more fascinating content about the ancient world by becoming a Patreon. In return, you receive exclusive early access to our special episodes, just like this one. You can also pre-order our new book right now. Your cheeky guide to the Roman Empire will be out later this year. However, if you lost all your money betting on a chariot race, please just tell someone about the show or give us a 5-star review. Until next time, we are yours in ancient Rome.